Your body doesn't fail suddenly, it warns you in whispers long before it collapses into a medical emergency. And sepsis is one of the few conditions where missing those whispers can cost a life within hours. An unusual fever or a sudden wave of chilling cold is one of the earliest and most revealing signals that the body's internal balance is being pushed beyond its limits. Because temperature is not just a number on a screen, but a living reflection of how every cell is responding to a threat. And when an infection enters the bloodstream or spreads aggressively through tissues, the immune system releases powerful chemical messengers that reset the brain's temperature center, raising the heat in an attempt to slow invading microbes. Yet in sepsis, this normally protective response becomes exaggerated and unstable, creating a state where the body is no longer carefully regulating itself, but struggling to keep control of its own reactions. Which is why a person might feel burning hot one moment and deeply cold the next, as if their inner climate has been thrown into disorder. And this swinging temperature is not random, but a sign that inflammatory signals are surging through the blood like electrical storms, touching every organ at once, forcing the heart, lungs, and blood vessels to adapt in ways that exhaust them. And even though fever is often seen as something to tolerate or ignore, in the context of sepsis, it is more like a distress flare sent up by the immune system, warning that the fight it is waging is no longer contained to one small area, but has spread across the whole internal landscape. And this is why people in the early stages of sepsis may say they feel strangely unwell in a way they cannot describe, because their temperature changes are not just heating the skin, but altering the chemistry of their blood, the speed of their metabolism, and the way oxygen is delivered to tissues. And as these shifts grow more extreme, cells begin to struggle to produce energy efficiently, which further fuels inflammation and drives the temperature even higher, creating a dangerous feedback loop. And when chills accompany fever, it is not because the body is cold in a simple sense, but because blood vessels are tightening and relaxing in erratic patterns as the nervous system tries to respond to overwhelming signals, making the person shake even while their internal temperature is rising. And this shaking is a physical expression of internal confusion, where the brain is receiving conflicting messages about whether to conserve or release heat. And all of this happens quietly at first, long before organs begin to fail, making fever and chills one of the most valuable early warnings that something far more serious than a routine infection is unfolding. And when we listen to these sensations instead of dismissing them, we are really listening to the language of the immune system, which is telling us that it has crossed from a controlled defense into a state of widespread alarm. And in that moment, the body is not asking for patience or endurance but for intervention. Because the longer this inflammatory storm is allowed to rage, the more likely it is to damage the delicate lining of blood vessels, reduce blood flow to vital organs, and push the entire system toward collapse, making that simple feeling of being feverish or strangely cold one of the most important clues that time is becoming the most precious medicine of all. A racing heart and rapid breathing are not just reactions to stress or fatigue, but deep biological alarms that the body is struggling to keep itself alive. Because when sepsis begins to take hold, the blood becomes thick with inflammatory molecules that cause blood vessels to widen and leak, lowering blood pressure and making it harder for oxygen to reach tissues. And to compensate for this invisible crisis, the heart is forced to beat faster and harder, trying to push what little oxygen remains through a network of vessels that no longer hold pressure the way they should, turning each heartbeat into a small act of emergency. And at the same time, the lungs respond by pulling in air more quickly, not because the person is exerting themselves, but because their cells are silently suffocating, demanding more oxygen than the damaged circulation can provide. And this combination of a pounding heart and shallow, hurried breaths creates a rhythm that feels unfamiliar, even frightening. Yet it is the body's desperate attempt to maintain balance in a system that is rapidly losing it. And what makes this so dangerous is that it can happen while someone is lying still, speaking calmly, or even trying to rest. Which is why it is so often misunderstood as anxiety or weakness rather than the physiological emergency it truly is. And beneath this visible rush of heart and lungs is a deeper story unfolding, where tiny blood vessels in the muscles, brain, and organs are being starved of oxygen, forcing cells to shift into inefficient forms of energy production that generate acid and further inflame the tissues, feeding back into the cycle that keeps the heart racing and the breathing fast. And as this continues, the heart begins to tire, not from physical effort but from biochemical overload, while the lungs struggle to keep up with the ever-increasing demand for oxygen. And the person may feel a tightness in the chest or an overwhelming sense of air hunger that is both physical and deeply unsettling, because the brain is being alerted that something is very wrong, and yet the cause is hidden in the bloodstream rather than in the air around them. And this is why paying attention to an unusually fast pulse or breathing that feels labored without obvious reason can be life-saving, since it is often one of the clearest early signals that the body is losing the battle to distribute oxygen where it is needed. And as sepsis advances, these systems are pushed further into overdrive, creating a state where the heart and lungs are working at their limits just to hold the line against organ failure. And when we understand this, we begin to see that a racing heart is not merely a symptom, but a narrative of survival being written in real time, each beat marking the body's attempt to outrun the damage being done, and each breath a quiet plea for the oxygen that keeps every cell alive, making this frantic internal tempo one of the most urgent warnings the body can offer before the storm becomes overwhelming. Confusion, dizziness, and that strange feeling of being disconnected from your surroundings are not signs of weakness or imagination, but reflections of the brain struggling to stay nourished and clear. When sepsis begins to disrupt the delicate balance of blood flow and chemistry that consciousness depends on, because the brain, more than any other organ, relies on a constant, richly oxygenated stream of blood to maintain awareness, memory, and emotional stability. And when widespread inflammation causes blood vessels to leak and pressure to fall, the brain is one of the first places to feel the loss, leading to subtle changes in thought, attention, and perception that may appear as forgetfulness, slowed reactions, or an eerie sense that the world has become slightly unreal. And this is not psychological in origin, but deeply biological, rooted in neurons that are suddenly being asked to function with less fuel and more toxic byproducts than they are designed to handle. And as oxygen delivery drops and inflammatory molecules cross into brain tissue, the electrical signals that allow us to think, speak, and recognize loved ones begin to lose their precision, like a radio station fading in and out through static, and the person may struggle to find words, lose track of time, or feel dizzy when they try to stand, because the brain's ability to regulate blood pressure and balance is also being impaired. And this cognitive fog can come and go in waves, making it easy to dismiss as tiredness or stress, even though it is actually one of the most serious indicators that the body's central command center is under threat. And what makes this so dangerous is that the brain often cannot communicate its distress clearly. So instead of sharp pain, it sends softer signals of confusion and detachment, which can be overlooked until the damage has progressed further and as sepsis continues. The buildup of inflammatory chemicals and metabolic waste in the blood creates an environment that is toxic to brain cells, pushing them into a state where they cannot maintain their normal electrical gradients, causing thought and awareness to fragment in ways that feel deeply unsettling to the person experiencing them. And this fragmentation is a mirror of the body's internal chaos, where systems that usually work in harmony are now pulling in different directions. And when someone with sepsis becomes suddenly confused or unusually sleepy, it is often because the brain is being deprived of the stable conditions it needs to stay alert, not because they are giving in to rest. And in recognizing this, we learn that mental clarity is not just a matter of willpower, but of circulation, oxygen, and finely tuned chemistry, all of which are threatened when infection turns into systemic inflammation. Making these early changes in awareness some of the most important clues that the body is in danger. Because once the brain begins to falter, it signals that the storm has reached the very center of who we are and how we experience the world. When the skin turns pale, blotchy, or strangely cold and clammy, it is not a simple surface reaction but a direct reflection of how deeply the body is struggling to keep itself alive. Because in the early stages of sepsis, the bloodstream becomes flooded with inflammatory signals that cause blood vessels to lose their normal tone, making blood pressure drop and forcing the nervous system to pull circulation away from the skin and push it toward the heart, lungs, and brain. And this sudden redirection leaves the outer layers of the body starved of oxygen and nutrients, which is why the skin can lose its natural warmth and healthy color and begin to look washed out, gray, or mottled with uneven patches of light and dark, as if the body were painting its own warning signs across the surface. And this change happens not because the skin itself is sick, but because it is being sacrificed in a desperate effort to preserve the organs that keep life going. And as tiny blood vessels near the surface tighten and collapse, less warm blood flows through them, making the skin feel cold even when the core temperature may be high with fever. And at the same time, the damaged vessel walls begin to leak fluid into surrounding tissues, creating that clammy or sticky feeling that feels so unsettling to the touch, which further reduces the volume of blood in circulation and worsens the strain on the heart, creating a vicious cycle where every attempt to protect the core weakens the periphery. And as oxygen delivery to the skin drops, cells there are forced into low-energy states that produce waste products, which irritate and inflame the tissue even more, deepening the mottled appearance and making the skin more fragile and slow to recover. And this fragility is not just cosmetic but symbolic of what is happening throughout the body, where organs are beginning to operate on the edge of what they can tolerate. And what makes these skin changes so important is that they give us a rare window into the invisible circulation crisis unfolding inside, allowing us to see with our eyes what the heart and blood vessels are failing to maintain. And when a person's hands or feet become unusually cold, or their skin looks pale and patchy in a way that is not normal for them, it is often because the body is no longer able to distribute blood evenly, a quiet admission that the system is under severe stress. And as sepsis advances, this uneven circulation can progress to more severe tissue damage, showing how quickly the body can move from compensation to collapse. And by learning to notice these changes, we are really learning to read the language of the bloodstream, which is telling us that it is running out of room to adapt and that urgent care is needed before the damage spreads beyond repair. A sudden drop in urine or a noticeable darkening of its color is one of the quietest yet most revealing signs that sepsis is beginning to affect the body at a deep and dangerous level, because the kidneys are among the first organs to suffer when blood flow becomes unstable, and their entire role depends on a steady, well-pressured stream of blood that allows them to filter waste, balance fluids, and keep the internal environment clean. So when widespread inflammation causes blood vessels to dilate and leak, the kidneys receive less and less of the circulation they need, leading them to slow their filtering process in an effort to protect themselves from injury. And this is why urine output drops or becomes concentrated and dark, as the body tries to conserve fluid while toxins quietly build up in the bloodstream. And this shift can happen long before any pain is felt. making it especially easy to overlook, even though it is a powerful signal that the body's internal purification system is struggling. And as waste products accumulate, they begin to affect every organ, including the brain, heart, and immune system, further fueling the cycle of inflammation that defines sepsis. And the kidneys, which normally work silently and continuously, become reluctant participants in this storm, reducing their activity as a last line of defense. Yet this protective slowing also allows harmful substances to circulate longer in the blood, deepening the stress on already overworked tissues. And what makes this sign so important is that it reflects not just dehydration or mild illness but a breakdown in one of the body's most essential survival mechanisms. Because when the kidneys cannot cleanse the blood, the internal environment becomes increasingly hostile to life. And noticing changes in urine is really noticing the health of the bloodstream itself, a simple observation that carries profound meaning in the context of sepsis, because it tells us that the flow of life through the body is no longer moving freely, and that the balance between cleansing and accumulation is tipping toward danger.